Welcome to The Explainer. We are jumping right into an absolutely wild sequence of events today, looking at how a massive commercial airliner was pushed right to the absolute brink. We're going to break down the timeline, the intense aviation math, and the split-second human decisions that almost brought a Boeing 777 out of the sky.
So let's get right into it. Mayday, Mayday, Singapore Airlines 319 Mayday fuel. That is literally one of the most chilling radio transmissions an air traffic controller can ever hear. It is the sound of a highly experienced flight crew realizing that time, options, and most importantly, fuel have almost completely run out.
And 1,000 kilograms is exactly why. In the grand scheme of aviation, for a massive twin-engine jet, 1,000 kilograms isn't really fuel. It's fumes. It was literally all that separated 280 passengers and crew from a catastrophic disaster. But how does a modern, meticulously planned flight end up with a ticking clock counting down to zero? Well, let's find out.
Part 1. The Flight and Fuel Math.
To really grasp this emergency, we've got to look at how the day started. On October 25th, 2022, everything kicked off as a perfectly routine journey. It was an overnight flight from London Heathrow straight through to Singapore's Changi Airport. Clear weather over Europe, standard flight path, relaxed mood. And it's actually fascinating when you look at the sheer level of expertise sitting in that cockpit. We are not talking about rookies here. The captain was a 55-year-old veteran with over 13,400 flight hours, and more than 10,000 of those were on the Boeing 777. The first officer had over 2,200 hours on this exact aircraft type too. So on paper, flying this incredibly capable Boeing 777-300ER, they were highly prepared for anything. And a huge part of that preparation involves the strict, really unforgiving math of aviation fuel. Because commercial jets don't just fill the tanks to the brim like a car. They calculate it in very specific buckets. You've got taxi fuel just to get to the runway, trip fuel for the actual journey, contingency fuel for unexpected headwinds, and alternate fuel in case they need to divert to another airport. But the absolutely crucial one is the final reserve. That is the emergency lifeline designed to keep the plane in the air for exactly 30 minutes. You never ever touch the final reserve unless everything else has completely fallen apart.
For this specific flight, they loaded a massive 106,100 kilograms of fuel. And thanks to some pretty excellent shortcuts over European airspace, they actually arrived near Singapore 30 minutes ahead of schedule. At that point, they still had about 7 tons of fuel left. Considering their final reserve requirement was only 3 tons, they had a massive, seemingly super safe cushion.
Part 2. Worsening weather at Singapore.
But nature has a funny way of completely disrupting the best-laid plans. Just as Flight 319 descended towards Singapore, a sudden, violently fast weather shift hit. We're talking massive storms, torrential rain, and swirling winds brewing right over Changi Airport. So, air traffic control instructed them to enter a holding pattern at a waypoint called PSBU. Now, holding pattern is basically just a racetrack in the sky. You fly in massive ovals, burning time, waiting for your turn to land. But here's the catch. Every single minute you spend circling up there, those huge engines are slowly and irreversibly draining away that crucial alternate fuel buffer.
And to make matters worse, the winds at their assigned runway, to right, shifted dangerously. The tailwinds suddenly exceeded 10 knots. Now, strict safety limits forced the immediate closure of that runway. And with alternate nearby airports completely clouded over by the exact same storm system, Flight 319's options were just vanishing into thin air.
Part 3. Diversion towards Batam.
So, facing an indefinite hold and a closed runway, the crew had to make a critical choice. They abandoned their approach into Singapore and set their sights on Batam, which is an alternative airport located just to the south in Indonesia. Now, Kuala Lumpur was technically the best backup facility, but it was just too far away for the fuel they had left. Batam, on the other hand, was incredibly close. But as the captain took manual control of the aircraft, which is standard procedure during a diversion, the tension really started to spike. They realized that the massive storm cell that was hovering over Singapore was now moving south. It was heading right for Batam. The ticking clock is getting louder now because their fuel had plummeted to just 5,900 kilograms. As they navigated toward Batam, holding out for air traffic control clearance, those 2 massive GE90 engines, literally the most powerful jet engines in the world, were just eating through the remaining reserves at a terrifying pace.
Part 4. Mayday Call, a real emergency.
As they approach Batam, the weather completely falls apart, and their fuel drops to 4,500 kilograms. At this point, the situation shifts from a manageable diversion into a really dire emergency. And there's a fascinating, absolutely crucial distinction in aviation terminology that happens right here. At 4:46 p.m., the crew declares minimum fuel. But minimum fuel is actually just an advisory. It tells air traffic control, hey, we can't accept any more delays, but it does not give you priority to land. However, Mayday fuel is an absolute drop-everything kind of emergency. It tells everyone on the frequency that you are dipping into your 30-minute final lifeline and you need the runway right now.
If we trace the timeline, you can see exactly how fast this escalated. At 4:46, they give the minimum fuel advisory. Just 2 minutes later, at 4:48 p.m., the captain gets back on the radio and officially declares Mayday fuel. Then, it takes another 7 agonizing minutes of coordination between different air traffic control sectors before Batam finally grants them absolute priority to land at 4:55 p.m. The emergency is officially on.
Part 5. Failed landing attempts.
But as you'll see, simply getting priority clearance to land was really only half the battle. Down below, the weather over Batam had become incredibly chaotic, and the crew was about to have to fight the airplane and the elements just to get the wheels on the tarmac. What happens next is a cascading series of errors and extreme weather. On their first approach to runway 22, they get hit with a 30-knot tailwind. That is far beyond the Boeing 777 structural limit of 15 knots and way past the airline's strict limit of 10, so they aborted. On the second attempt, they engaged the autoland system way too late, literally just 2 nautical miles from the runway. That resulted in a terrifyingly steep descent rate of 1,300 feet per minute, so they had to abort again.
Now, to abort a landing, pilots execute what's called a go-around. And guys, it is an extreme mechanical maneuver. You push the throttles to the maximum, the engines absolutely roar to full power, and you essentially yank a 300-ton aircraft back up into the sky. During their second attempt, they executed this incredibly aggressive maneuver a mere 132 feet off the ground.
And here is the truly shocking reality of a go-around. A single aborted landing maneuver in a Boeing 777 devours roughly 1,500 kilograms of fuel in just moments. Because they initiated that second go-around so close to the ground, those engines had to work incredibly hard. After fighting gravity to get back up into the sky, they looked at their gauges. They had under 2,000 kilograms of fuel left.
Completely desperate, they set up for a third attempt, this time trying runway 04. But at 5:09 p.m., they get caught in a severe downdraft. The cockpit alarms start screaming, warning them of a massive 1,400 feet per minute sink rate. So at just 212 feet above the ground, they are forced to execute a third go-around. Their fuel tanks are now practically completely empty.
Part 6. Final chance and lessons. The crew is completely out of options at this point. They don't have the fuel for another missed approach, and there is absolutely no way they can divert anywhere else. They have to put the plane on the ground right now, on this fourth attempt, no matter what. Relying on pure desperation and raw piloting skill, they execute a visual teardrop approach. It's a tight, looping maneuver used to quickly align with runway 22. At 5:19 p.m., fighting a really dangerous tailwind, the wheels finally slam onto the bottom runway. The relief in that cockpit must have been absolutely unimaginable. When they parked the aircraft, the gauges showed they had safely landed with less than 1,000 kilograms of fuel left.
Following the incident, an official investigation was launched, of course, and the findings were pretty clear. This near disaster was caused by a highly volatile mix of extreme, unpredictable weather combined directly with human factors. The crew ignored tailwind limits, they rushed their approaches, and they made stubborn decisions by trying to force an automated landing from way too close. Today, this flight serves as a vital case study for airline training worldwide. It's a perfect illustration of how quickly a completely routine flight can unravel.
Which brings us to our final thought. The captain had over 13,000 hours of flight time, yet they still ended up mere seconds away from empty tanks. It really forces us to ask, how do we balance vast human experience with the strict adherence to safety margins when the clock is mercilessly ticking down? It is a fascinating look at the human element inside complex systems. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible breakdown of Flight 319. I hope this explainer gave you a clear understanding of just how razor-thin the margins in the sky can really be. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.